I'm going to start this morning with I watched a movie this past week. It's an old movie. I say old, it's 10 years old. So, in some ways, that's old. Um, has anybody seen this? Oh, yeah. Anybody got it on your to watch list? Because I'm going to give some spoiler alerts here. So I'm just warning you now. I'm giving a couple of little spoiler alerts. It was an interesting movie. It came out with great reviews, won all kinds of awards, and so I've kind of had it on my to watch list forever. And I finally had the opportunity to watch it, and it was. I thought the movie was okay. You know, it was kind of what you would expect. It's one man who is the captain of a commercial cargo ship. They are overtaken by pirates, and then the pirate takes the captain captive. And so it's how this all plays out, and it's a good movie. And I thought it was, it kept my interest. But it was the final scene that just, man, buried me. It was so powerful. The final scene, and what had happened was there was like this just a blaze of gunfire that kind of ended the whole ordeal. They take the captain of the ship, Tom Hanks, and they take him upon a Navy ship and take him into the medical bay, and they're checking on him and seeing if he's okay, and seeing what kind of injuries he had sustained. And he's just kind of in shock. And as he's sitting here, and trying to grasp everything that he had just come through, and you have this very reassuring voice that's telling him, "It's okay. It's over. You're safe." And he just breaks down at that moment. Um, so again, very very powerful moment. I'm going to take that off for a second and see if that's causing interference. Um, very very powerful moment. Just that moment when everything was over, and he's safe, and the danger was gone. Really, boy, that sank me there. That was really good. Well, we're in the midst of talking about the fall festivals that Scripture talks about. So Leviticus chapter 23 lays out 7 times of the year when God says, "I'd like to spend some time with you specifically on these dates or these times of the year." And we have gone through 2 of the fall ones. Now there are 4 earlier in the year, and those are very significant. Historically, they are significant because they how they were to live their lives in the moment. It had to do with some very practical things like harvest times, and it has something to tell us prophetically, not just in the person of Jesus Christ, but also in how is it that we are supposed to be living our lives. And because the first 4, Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost, all became very significant in the life of Jesus, then we ask the question, well, what do the last 3 in the fall time have to do with Jesus, and what do they tell us? So we've already talked about, the very first week, and part of this series that we're doing called Not Yet, we talked about Isaiah 58, simply because Isaiah 58 sets the tone and says, listen, um, don't come to God with this idea, this heart, this of I have to do these things because they're on a list. Okay, don't come to God and give a sacrifice, but do it with a sour heart. Don't fast and then just be really bad mood all day because you're hungry. Okay, and God is pointing out, if you're going to be doing these things for God in the name of God, then make sure that you're doing it with the right heart, because the heart is the point and the purpose of these things. God is trying to change our hearts from a heart of stone into a heart of flesh. He's trying to take us into people who don't read the law, but people who live the law in the idea of instruction or living in unity with God in the purpose and mission of God. And so as we look at these things, Isaiah 58 is warning us against doing them out of rote, just habit. And so then we step into the first fall feast, which was trumpets. Trumpets tells us a little bit about historically what they would use it for, but prophetically it tells us that it's pointing to the return of Jesus. When Jesus, the King, comes back, and it's gonna initiate change. It should initiate change in us. When there is a new king, a new ruler, they decide what the new priorities are, what the new direction is. And so when King Jesus returns, we should be fully on board with the idea that Jesus is taking us in a certain direction. We then talked about the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement pictures Judgment Day, ultimately, and there will be a time when there's a separation between those who are drawing close to God and those who are saying thanks but no thanks, and therefore are leaving or going away from God. Obviously, the desire that Scripture is calling us to is to align with God. We talked about the process of forgiveness that goes along with that, and forgiveness is a huge part of drawing close to God. And I think we struck some chords last week talking about forgiveness because it's a difficult concept. Just to state the idea of forgiveness, it drums up guilt in a lot of us because we have issues in our lives that we feel require forgiveness, but we don't feel like we can do it. And so we tried to clarify what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. If you weren't here, I encourage you to go listen to that. That should be coming out about half an hour ago online. And so you can check out that message. After last week's message, when we talked about the process of atonement and how it connects with the idea of forgiveness, I had someone come up and say, I mentioned reconciliation, but I did not dig into reconciliation and how Jesus is our reconciliation. So I want to talk just for a moment as we begin today's message about the reconciliation. Now, if you are new here, I want to acknowledge and point out that oftentimes when people visit, they kind of get this idea, or they have this question, why are you so Jewish? Okay, and so because we're talking about things like Yom Kippur, I see some laughter. Some of you already leaned over and asked that question today. We're talking about things like Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, and we're not talking about Jewish things. We're talking about biblical things that reveal who our God is to his people. Now, in the Older Testament, we could say that was to the nation of Israel. We today are God's people. And so what is it revealing to us? It's speaking to us. Remembering again that the entire Bible is relevant to us and to our walk with him through Jesus. So as we look into this idea of reconciliation, it is the Greek word, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, katalage. And it means this idea of restoring to favor, putting back in a right relationship. It means there was something that was lost, but now it's been found. Okay, it wasn't in a wrong place, but now it's in a right place. It was far away, but now it's been drawn close. And in context of relationships, it means they were strangers, but now they're friends. And so there's been this reconciliation, and the reconciliation is between us and God. And this happens only through Jesus Christ and the work that he has done on the cross and through his resurrection. Now, we talked about atonement and forgiveness, and atonement and forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. It lays the groundwork for reconciliation, but it's not the same thing. It paves the way, but again, not the same thing. But reconciliation comes into view when we begin to talk about the Feast of Tabernacles. So today, this is the third fall feast that we're going to be talking about. It's the Feast of Tabernacles, or in Hebrew, it's called Sukkot. And just the reason why, because what you see on the screen here, that is a tabernacle or a booth or a tent. And in Hebrew, one of those is called a sukkah. If you had a bunch of them, plural, they are called Sukkot. So this is the Feast of Sukkot. Now, there's so much imagery. If you've heard any of the other messages upon any of these times that God is asking us to gather together with him, there is imagery that just abounds in every single one of them. And Sukkot is certainly no different. There's, first of all, an idea of ingathering, bringing people together. That's envisioned by the ingathering of the crops, the fruit from the crops. It's a time of harvest, so you bring all of the things that the harvest has produced together. There is a prayer at this time that the land turn from a brown land to a green land, so a time for a prayer for restoration of the land. Something that was dead becomes alive. There is this time, and we saw in these fall feasts, the feast of Rosh Hashanah, or trumpets, that the judgment books are opened. This is some poetic imagery in the Bible. The judgment books are opened on Rosh Hashanah, on the feast, or on the Day of Atonement. They are closed. Judgment is given. And now on the feast of Sukkot, then you have the joyful outpouring, because all is well now. The books have been balanced. Okay, everybody has been put in right relationship where they belong. All of the columns have been equaled out. Okay, so this is what the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, is about. In the Bible, whenever a temple was built, there have been two temples, the first and the second temple. They were inaugurated or initialized with this feast, Sukkot. So they were celebrated with this time. King Solomon celebrated it with Sukkot when they had it in the newer, or in Ezra and Nehemiah. They opened up the temple with Sukkot. Even after the Maccabean revolt, they rededicated the temple with a celebration of Sukkot. There is a water libation ceremony, becomes very significant. There's a time where they draw water from the pool of Siloam, they take it up to the altar, they pour it out. It's in the context of doing that Jesus stands among the people and says that I will give you living water. They had 75-foot candelabras in the courtyard of the temple. And the wicks of those candelabras were made out of the worn-out robes of the priests. And these things were enormous and gave light to, bright as day at night. It's in that context that Jesus stood up and said, I am the light of the world. Okay, so much imagery coming out of these things. You can look at the time of Sukkot, and there is very good reason to believe that this is the time, this is the time of year when Jesus was born, during this festival. Okay, not in December. Sorry, I'm just going to keep ignoring that and go right on. Not in December, but Jesus was born most likely during Sukkot. And so when we should be, if we were going to celebrate the birth of Jesus, it would be in this time, in conjunction with this, and all of its meaning. There's even a prayer, this isn't out of the Bible, but I find it very interesting that the sages, it's an ancient prayer that says that when the Messiah comes, we will celebrate Sukkot in the presence of God, and the sukkah that we are standing in is going to be fashioned out of, it's either a really bad message or a really good message. I'm not sure which one it is. I'm not sure if God's trying to stop it or the enemy.
Yeah.
What? My hands are doing it?
Yeah.
Yeah, whenever you put your hands at that level,
So the Sukkot, it's but it says that this sukkah will be fashioned out of the skin of the Leviathan, and there's some just beautiful imagery there, because the Leviathan is the same concept as the serpent from Genesis 3. And so God will finally defeat that serpent, and we'll make a house out of that, and we'll just celebrate that time when there will be no more opposition to God. So all kinds of imagery that has flowed into this. But what I want to focus on today specifically is this structure and where it was and how it was used. So in order to do that, I want to point out what God is stating why Sukkot is celebrated. Okay, so God says, here's the setting. I want you to think of this during this festival. When Israel was taken out of Egypt, they were in slavery in Egypt, and God saved them out of Egypt through Moses, and they traveled then through the desert. Now, sometimes our Bibles say wilderness. Understand that wilderness is not like the Great Rocky Mountains. It's not trees. It's not rivers. It is barren, dry, brutal desert. Okay. Scripture also calls it the vast, terrible wasteland. And so there's the people moving from their captivity to the promised land that God is offering. And it's that journey when they are living in these type of structures and walking with God. Okay, so this is the setting. God, I want you to envision this. So take a moment and kind of conjure that up in your mind and all that's going to take. And it took them 40 years to make that journey. The materials that these things are made from. First of all, as they were traveling through the wilderness, God was walking with them in the form of a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. Right? Then we get to the materials. The materials that God specifically says make these out of is the lulav, the myrtle, the willow, and the etrog. At this point, it's really not relevant that you know what those are because I don't either. But the point is they are green and they are lively and it is fruit and it is supposed to conjure up the image of the Garden of Eden. Okay? So you're supposed to surround this little tent with green stuff. When you're in the midst of a wilderness, you're supposed to have this little Garden of Eden, your own little personal Garden of Eden in the midst of the wilderness. And this is where you're living. It's about returning back to the presence of God. It's about going back to that moment before the fall when we walked with God, we were in alignment with God, everything was well and right and good with God, and we were in the garden with Him, and He was walking with us. And so this is all being pictured out in this journey. This is little shelter, our own little personal Garden of Eden. Now, that is how the tabernacle and the temple were decorated to look like the garden. But this is not now community. This is now your own little personal, your own little place I'm going to create with God. It's celebrating the time spent with God in the past, is what this is doing. And then also it provides shade and protection. And so as you're sitting in this, when God walked with Israel from Egypt, He walked in, again, the form of a pillar of a cloud by day, and when that provided shade for them. If you've been out in the desert in the Middle East, in the middle of the day, it got up to like 120 degrees while I was there. And the sun beating down on you is brutal. So to have a little bit of shade, God providing shade by a pillar of cloud, was such a huge difference. And so here, this little tent is supposed to provide some shelter, some protection from the brutal sun, brutal heat during the day, and then the plummeting temperatures at night. Whereas God at night was walking with them by a pillar of fire, providing some warmth. So they're living in the tabernacles during these 8 days. It's an 8-day celebration as a reminder of the shade and the protection that's offered by God in those times. And then we want to think about the location. I think this is the most significant because it's in the wilderness. Again, this is desert, dry area, barren, brutal land. It's not a place where that sustains life, and it certainly doesn't do it easily. It's a negative picture. Okay, vast and terrible wilderness, dry. It's void of water. It's void of supplies to live on. It's void of vegetation. We've talked about the biblical view of the sea a lot, and how in the Bible the imagery of the sea is a chaotic place, a place of death. The desert has the exact same analogy. Okay, the desert carries an idea of chaos. The desert carries an idea of exile and abandonment. The desert carries this idea of when you're out in there, that then you are away from life-sustaining things. It's a negative place. It was a difficult period of time in Israel's history as they were traveling from Egypt to the place of promise. And it was filled with suffering. Understand this. Moving from bondage to freedom, moving from Egypt to the promised land, it was filled with suffering. It was filled with sickness. It was filled with difficulty. And even was filled with death. And it's because of that, it's for that very reason that the Feast of Tabernacles is the most joyous time of the year. That's why when we celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, we should be showing joy more than any other time of the year. And they seem to kind of go against one another. So why, we ask? And it's because God was with them for every step of the way. So again, the most joyous. There's writing that talks about if you haven't seen the festival of celebration for Sukkot, then you've never seen happiness. You've never seen joy. It harkens back to this time of difficulty. Understand, again, we're in the wilderness. Terrible, terrible place. We're in the wilderness. It's not a time of plenty. When we're thinking about this time when we had nothing, when it was hot and we were thirsty and we were hungry, it was not a time of plenty. It was a time where it was difficult and painful. And at the same time, it was powerful and glorious. And the reason was because they were together as a people and together with their God. They had very little, but they looked to that time as the time when they were rich. It's a celebration of the time in the desert with God. So they're putting up their Sukkot, and they're thinking, we were traveling with God in this difficult time. We're thinking about that time. But it's also a reminder that in the future, for us, as we celebrate this and we look back to that time, we know that in the future there's going to be a time where we're back in the presence with God. This pictures our eternity with God. When we live with Him, we set up a home with Him, and we lean upon God for eternity, back in His presence. After Jesus returns, after atonement is doled out, after the books are closed, then we can look forward to a time of living with God for eternity. But it's even more than that. Because it's about today, too. It's about the struggles that we encounter now. It's about the wilderness wanderings that we find ourselves in 2023. It's a dry and barren places where we are in pain, where we are in confusion, where we are in doubt, and we're even dealing with death around us. But the magnificent message, the beautiful message of this, the beautiful message of the Feast of Tabernacles is that God will meet us in the desert. God's not waiting at the end of the journey. God hasn't went and set up His tent in the promised land. He isn't back way ahead of us and saying, come on, just get through it, and when you're done, then we'll be together. That's not the message of God. God is stating, listen, while you are in the desert, I'm with you. I'm walking with you. And that's the thing. He wants to meet us in the barren places. He wants to meet us where we are struggling. He wants to be there with us where we are in pain. He wants to walk with us through these things, provide for us as we slowly make our way through them. Tabernacles is an attitude of joy in the midst of hardship. Tabernacle is a celebration and thankfulness that God is all we have. And sometimes everything you have just isn't enough. Sometimes everything you have, you could have the world and everything you have isn't enough. But sometimes the only thing you have is more than you'll ever need. Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks puts it this way. He says, to know that life is full of risk and yet to affirm it, to sense the full insecurity of the human situation and yet to rejoice. This, for me, is the essence of faith. Sukkot is a time that causes us to ask, where is it that we are truly rich? Where are we truly blessed?